With over half of enterprise security budgets going towards detection and response in 2020, the challenge is investing in solutions that can migrate and scale with your business. ExtraHop helps security teams spot threats up to 95% faster and respond 60% more efficiently in hybrid and multi-cloud environments with cloud-native network detection and response. Kick the tires in the full product demo at securityweekly.com/ExtraHop.
Welcome back to Business Security Weekly. I am your host, Matt Alderman, joined by Paul Asadorian and Jason Albuquerque. B-Sides Boston is back in action for their 10-year anniversary. The conference will be held on Saturday, September 26th, and tickets are only $10. You can get yours at bsidesbos.org. Some of the Security Weekly team will be in our own Discord channel. At our own channel on the B-Sides Boston Discord server, answering questions and maybe doing some contests. Also, Security Weekly is ramping up our webcast technical training program for the rest of 2020. In September, you can find out why traditional data security can't be zero trust and learn how to reduce the blast radius of your cloud infrastructure. Visit securityweekly.com/webcast to see what we have coming up, or visit securityweekly.com/on-demand to view our previously recorded webcasts. We had a long break there. We were having so much fun with John in this segment. We couldn't get enough, so we kept the conversation going a little bit.
We did. Super interesting.
But yeah, and what I thought was interesting is the tie into the risk management side. Yeah. And some of the articles this week talk about aspects of that, right? I mean, the first article I pulled in here is, does your board really understand cyber risks?
Well, I mean, based on our last conversation, hardware? I don't think CISOs understand the risk at this point. Exactly. We're at a point where I will say they would like to. I can't guarantee they do. But right? Because the conversations are starting to happen now.
But I think what we talked about in the previous side is understanding the threat.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. And I think how it fits in the risk equation is the conversations you want to have with your C-suite and your board as to really, okay, so what is our risk level? Right. But understanding the threat, I think, is John has been doing, and team has been doing a great job of doing, to understand that there's a threat here that you may not understand the scope.
We've been blind to.
Right, the scope of that threat. Yeah. And I think that's largely what you're educating the board about, too, is not necessarily jumping right into the whole risk thing, is you've got to understand the threats. You mentioned probability and impact, right, which I love has been the FAIR model of assessing risk as well. In all that, that's the conversations you have to have.
And it's my job to translate that to the C-suite and the board, right?
Right.
So my team needs to gather that information, gather that context, and now a new variable to pop in there, right? Because we talked about that earlier, getting rid of that blind spot.
Right.
But then it's my job to take that information and bring it to the board and say, here's our, because they don't want to hear about how many firmware vulnerabilities we have, or OS vulnerabilities, or application vulnerabilities, right?
Right.
They want 50,000-foot view of where are we vulnerable? Where do we need to invest? Where do we need to focus?
Right. And I think that conversation would tie into minimizing the impact of an incident, right? Because I think that's the real big differentiator is, if we were to come under attack and it was, let's say, ransomware, right, which the board is probably starting to understand all of these
100%.
terms, right, we could minimize the impact if we protect this attack vector. If we don't, there is a probability that we could be replacing machines rather than rebuilding machines, and that has a business cost. So it's a business continuity and security conversation that has to be had. That is actually my greatest fear.
In revenue, because outage equals revenue loss, right? So if you have systems that are vulnerable to these firmware attacks, and it brings down your operations, and your company can no longer make money for a day, 2 days, a week, 2 weeks,
it's a big deal.
It's hurting revenue, right?
And I think the risk appetite component of this really makes sense in this particular case, because maybe I don't want to run my own data center and manage firmware vulnerabilities because it's too high of a risk.
Right.
I'd rather give it to an infrastructure as a service company and make sure they're taking care of it.
Right. But then my job, like we talked about in the break, my job is to figure out if they're doing their jobs.
Yep.
Right. Because third-party risk management now.
Yep. Yeah. No, you're right. Yeah. Now you've got that governance role coming into the to the mix, because now you have to manage all those third-party relationships.
Right. But I mean, the key for someone in a leadership position who's speaking to other C-levels and speaking to the board is to know that appetite. What's the appetite of the organization so you can make some good decisions, right? And I think that only comes over time. That comes over having conversations, building the relationship with the board, giving them the right context over time, allowing them time to learn, right? Because they need to learn. This is a whole new world for them. So, it's over time you're going to get to that place, but you're going to have to get in front of them as much as you possibly can.
Yep.
Yeah, that ties into the second article. Do companies need CISOs and CIOs as board members? Do they need that technical expertise on the board itself? Not as a relationship to talk about it, but do they need actual board members that understand aspects of this to be more informed?
The answer to that is hell yeah. Absolutely, right? Because you need those level of subject matter experts. I mean, we've said it, the article says it. Every company is a technology company at this point in time. What company do we know? What vertical do we know that's not leveraging technology to some level of a degree? It doesn't matter if you're outsourcing it somewhere else. You still need to understand the risk that's there. You still need to be able to make intelligent decisions. And really, the beauty and the makeup of a really good board is the diversity on the board. That determines the success of an organization if you have that good diversity across the board members. And having a technology SME is essential.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting. Approximately 70% of new independent directors came from CEO, operating, or senior finance experience with no mention of technology experience.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, the opening line in this article is diversity not only includes gender and racial diversity, but diversity of thought. Huge. Absolutely huge.
Yeah, absolutely. And to have some of that outside expertise participating in these different boards, I think is a diversity of thought that's definitely required here.
Businesses are so dependent on technology these days. You have to have an SME on your board.
Yeah. Well, that's good for some of the existing CIOs and CISOs out there. They might get some independent board seats now.
That'd be great.
Exactly. Next article, 10 value adds that CISOs can deliver.
Yep.
There's a couple here I wanted to hit on because I thought there were a couple interesting ones in here. But Jason, any thoughts on this top 10 list?
Yeah, I mean, I look at it and I look at CISOs and how they operate within businesses, and some of them are tactical, and you can see it in some of the examples. They're very tactical type examples, but you can see the CISOs are very strategic within their organization because they're talking about things like making security a selling point, helping drive revenue, protecting intellectual property, right? Because in turn, that means you're really securing that revenue and keeping your own intellectual property yourself so no one can steal it and use it and pull away from your client base. Those were the folks that were very, very strategic in my mind because that's always been my driver, right? My driver hasn't been going in as a leader and saying, I'm going to save you X amount of money over time. I do that, right? But my main focus is how do I make security a differentiator so we can drive revenue, bring revenue in, right? Because that's what the rest of our C-suite within the organization are talking about. Yes, I can identify economies of scale. I can identify places where we can consolidate. But ultimately, my goal is how to take that and now turn it into a revenue-generating conversation with the rest of the C-suite.
Yeah, no, I agree. The one that was really interesting to me is identify policy and procedure lapses and streamline regulatory controls. In my early days of consulting, I remember going in and looking at policies and procedures. And I remember these things being like huge documents. And I'm like, what are you trying to do? I'm like, to get an audit against this is like crazy, right? And this was back in the early days of compliance. And I saw that as an opportunity to streamline, so what's driving your policies and procedures? Let's put the right policies and procedures in place that also can streamline my regulatory reporting. But it looks like there's still some gaps in that policy procedure work.
Oh, yeah, totally. And in a lot of instances, and I see it all the time, you don't necessarily understand what's required of you as an organization because you can look at all these regulatory requirements and if you start looking at it, it's not even applicable to your type of business. So to be able to identify that, and we talk about it all the time at Carousel, focus on good busy, not bad busy. Bad busy is chasing your tail for these controls that may not even be relevant to what you do, right? We see it all the time with vendor risk management as well, where companies come to us and say, hey, I want you to fill out this 1,000 question vendor risk SIG, right? Where they're doing this information gathering, and it's like, the team looks at it and goes, 800 of those questions aren't even applicable to what we do for that organization. It's the same thing with regulatory controls.
Exactly. Yeah, because I think the SIG's, like 1,400 questions.
Oh my God!
Now?
If you do the full, it's insane. Yeah, it's absolutely insane.
Nuts.
And some organizations just go kind of heads down and just go fill it out. Well, I don't want to be wasting time. I don't want bad busy. So fill out what's relevant, and everything else is NA, because we don't do that. We don't store information. We don't process information. We're not transmitting information.
Right.
Done. We're not giving you a cloud application. Done. Wipe out 800 of those questions. We're good to go.
Yeah, that's why when I built the third-party vendor management program, that's exactly what we did. We just gated all the appropriate sections. So if it wasn't in scope, you just skip that part.
That's it.
But people haven't figured that out. I mean, God, that was 16 years ago, Jason. I was doing this, and you're still dealing with some of these
today.
questionnaires.
Happens all the time.
Crazy.
Yep.
How can the C-suite support CISOs in improving cybersecurity? Seeing the theme on this week?
Totally. Well, again, cybersecurity, our posture is shared, right? I depend on my peers to help ensure that their departments are operating the way that we would expect them to, right? And sharing information. It goes back to the relationship side. You have to understand what those business units are doing in order to make good decisions, in order to influence them, in order to guide them, right?
One of the themes that I've gleaned in interviewing, I don't remember her name now, from Google, that talked about site reliability engineers and the changing roles at Google. It's interesting. Sumedh from Qualys talked about making pretty much those exact same changes at Qualys to support a DevOps first, and I wouldn't say agile development. He actually, I believe in that interview, said we tried some of the agile stuff and it just didn't work. But a more agile process to developing software. Now, both of those individuals have a tremendous amount of experience managing software, managing people, managing engineers, right? And what I gleaned from both of those interviews definitely relates to this article, that you can get help from the C-suite with security. And sure, there's technological controls, there's compliance, as we were just talking about. One of the things I've noticed is a huge change is the organizational structure of these business units. And the trend I'm seeing is you've got developers, engineer, or traditionally you had developers, and then you had maybe QA people, you had your IT operations, and then you had security people, and we all lived in our separate silos, right? And what the newer structures are really doing, and this is really much of what they talk about in the Unicorn Project, in the book by Gene Kim, is if you build more functional teams that are responsible for delivering some piece of technology, in all those siloed roles that existed before, guess what? They're all on the same team now. Now, you still have a security that, in Sumedh, I thought was very, very good about explaining the newer role of security in defining the policies, right? Defining, helping define what does break a build and what doesn't, right? And some of the security priorities. That functional team now can develop code, they can deploy code, they can secure code, and that is all done on one team, and they're responsible for that modular, application.
Now take it out of just the technology stack now. Bring it to the finance stack or the HR stack. You have to have folks embedded with those teams as well to make sure that their processes are on point, right? To make sure any technologies they're looking at are on point. To make sure, HR hiring practices. At this point, the CISOs, has a level of responsibility with HR to make sure background checks are there and we're doing the right things from that perspective. We run a services organization, so I have to engage with our services team to make sure our managed services processes, our change management, problem management, all has security embedded in it, right? And that's the thing. Best practices, technical security, controls. So now you're having that conversation outside of the technology team and inside of all of these other business units. That's the way you get the culture, right? Because if those C-levels who head the other business units are having those conversations downstream and managing that downstream, now folks across the organization are talking about security, right? And they're putting it first.
Yeah, sales and CRM.
Absolutely.
And the security around protecting all your customer data.
Think about the data that salespeople put inside of CRMs. They're putting, the CIO's kid's birthday because they want to send a card, right? Or this information about their customers because they want to have a relationship. They want to remember that information. But in many instances, that could be very, very sensitive info.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so all those different C-levels need to be able to bring that aspect of security down.
That's
right. So people understand the impact.
Yeah, and you have to be able to relate it to their business unit and the way it could impact their business unit, the piece that they own, because they're always going to say, what's in it for me, right? How is this going to affect me? So if you can relate it to their business unit and potentially show them what could be exposed and how it could affect them and their team, now I think you open their eyes, and now they're going to want to have that conversation.
Yeah. Because those other risks are around brand and reputation and revenue impact,
you
right?
Got it.
Now it's more relevant to them. Yeah, definitely. Think you're spending enough on security? Now, this article talks about 4. I found 3.
I had to use my toes, but I still couldn't find the 4th.
I couldn't find the 4th one either. So journalists, when you say there's 4 things, there better be 4 sections and not 3. But let's put that aside for a second. Do you hack yourself until you're secure? I mean, that was a weird recommendation to me.
I mean, I
think it's just phrased strangely. I think in any process, you need to test it, right? And have a continuous process to test where your security posture is. That could be a project, that could be an organizational, like, your email and communications. Like, how are we ensuring that's really secure, right? And that's going to look different in each of the areas of business. Are we simulating a business email compromise and seeing how we react to it, right? But there's also a certain level of maturity. I think on ESW, PSW this week, we'll be talking about maturity levels. Synopsys did a great report that will be a yearly report they've been doing since 2009 on that. And I think you have to hack yourself in accordance with your maturity model, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's basic common sense. If you know security controls are not in place and you're working on a project to do it, there's no sense in going to test it because the tests are going to fail, right? I mean, and this is like 101 basics of building a security program that we probably talked about on the show almost 20 years ago.
Yeah, I think this article should have been, here are some things you can look at to see, right? Because, I mean, there's so many other variables that are involved in this.
Let's go to the second one, follow a framework. Well, Jeff Mann's going to tell you PCI, DSS, and you're going to have to implement the 200 plus controls in PCI. But is that appropriate for your organization?
If you're not, you're not processing credit card transactions, probably not appropriate, right? You got to find a framework that's relevant to your business.
Yeah, that's the key, right? Find what fits, and remember, a framework is a framework is a framework.
And you can modify
it's some guidance, right? I mean, if you look at NIST 853 and so many controls that are in that, how many of them are relevant to your organization? Well, figure out what's relevant and manage to that. I think having a framework of some sort, some kind, as guidance and some type of a North Star to head toward is great. Sure, it gives you something to follow. But at the end of the day, it's not the gold mine there, right? That's not what's going to make you secure. If your CEO, we always say that funny adage, the CEO walks by and says, "Are we secure today?" No.
Right.
And that's why I think the risk management side of this is so important, because you also have to understand the risks posed to your organization, your risk appetite, and what parts of a framework are you going to adopt and prioritize, not just adopt a framework and implement the whole thing.
Right. And how much you stand to lose as part of that, right? Because now you can actually have the conversation around, if that vulnerability were exploited and something were to happen, whether or not you're bringing down systems or there's an outage or something like that, now you can actually articulate, what the impact to the organization would be. But again, it's one piece of a massive puzzle.
Exactly. Look, you could do the math, like in her example. You're not going to justify that from a budgeting perspective, I don't think, though. I mean, those numbers just are ridiculous, right?
Yeah, right. No, I agree.
So I don't like that last one, because I'm like, okay, well, it could cost me, 40% of my customers and X million $1 in damages. And you do that math and you're like, well, this is what we should be spending instead. I don't think those correlate either.
No, I agree.
Yeah. Psychology of human error could help businesses prevent security breaches. Some interesting stats in here. But I think the premise is, look, if employees are unwilling to admit their mistakes, if organizations judge them severely, it's the psychology of it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I would argue it's funny. They went into like age demographics here in this article, and they talked about how older employees, have less are less of a threat in clicking on phishing. I'm saying there, wait a minute, they're probably not admitting it.
We actually talked about aspects of this research with Masha Sadova on a micro interview for Black Hat.
Yeah.
And I don't know if she conducted her own research that was similar or was referring to others' research or kind of pooling them together, but this seems to have found the same or similar things that Masha found, was that younger employees, in terms of years of service with the company, are actually more likely to succumb to phishing attacks.
That's what this says too.
Yeah, and then it kind of skips the middle and kind of goes right to the end, where the more senior employees are also more likely.
Yeah, this talked about aged over 51.
Yeah.
As the other demographic.
So it's age, but there's also
you want to know what, though? It has so much
service
to do with your culture too, because
it does.
People are not going to admit that they did anything wrong if you have a culture that is going to lay the hammer down on them, right? It's just not going to happen. Where you have a more open culture that says, listen, if something's wrong, raise your hand right away, because we want to know, we need to know. We're not going to slap you for it. We just need to know something's happening so we can react the way we need to react. You're going to get more people raising their hand, right? Where you have that more open culture. It depends, right? It depends on the culture of all these organizations that they surveyed, whether or not this is valid data or not.
Well, I think the culture is one aspect that ties back into the conversations we were having with the earlier articles. The second thing is, though, I think, look, younger people are used to technology. I mean, they've had technology all their lives. I mean, we didn't have technology until we were in our teens to 20s, right? I mean, so
I mean, air quotes technology, right?
Yeah, right.
Technology, like the instant, I think, communications and messaging certainly, Matt, is something that the younger generation has had since, like you said, they were born, right? We had technology, but it didn't. It wasn't as embedded in our lives, and it wasn't as that instant on communications.
Yeah, but the demographic who grew up on technology also grew up on the fact that breaches and viruses and all this stuff were happening.
They're more
too.
aware of
they're more aware of the
scams.
risk that comes with it too.
Yeah.
Well, you'd hope.
And I thought,
you could argue that. You could argue that. They should.
Yeah.
They should be.
Should be. But the other two items that I just pulled out, right? 45% of respondents cited distraction, and 57% of remote workers admit they are more distracted. Well, duh.
Well, welcome to the world. I mean, we're all running 1,000 miles an hour, and guess what? We kicked it up to 1,500 miles an hour the second COVID hit, because now everything's just going crazy. And as an executive or a security leader or someone within the organization, you have to realize that folks are running 1,000 miles an hour. They're caught in the whirlwind. They're caught in the day-to-day. And most likely, they're not going to be thinking security on the tip of their tongue. So you have to help reinforce that.
Yeah, I think they're thinking, all right, I got to get my job done. I got to try to figure out how to leverage this system to get my job done as quickly as I can. And they're not thinking about, oh, well, should I click on that link or shouldn't I? Yeah.
Agreed.
It's definitely a challenge in remote workforce. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me today. Thank you, everyone, for watching and listening. We'll see you next week on Business Security Weekly.